So as someone who's just learning what sensory is, please don't stress about knowing all of those big, long words. Sensory processing, sensory integration, sensory modulation, discrimination, dyspraxia. There's so many words out there. Hey everybody, it's Ash the OT, and in today's video, we are going to be talking all about sensory. If you're tuning into this video, then you probably have never heard of sensory before, or if you have, you still are kind of confused about exactly what it is, because it can be a quite difficult concept to understand. But in this video, I'm gonna break it all down for you and try to make it as simple as possible to understand. If you've never tuned in to one of my videos before, then welcome to my channel. I am a pediatric occupational therapist, and I work with parents to provide them tools and strategies in order to help their little ones to learn, grow, and make progress in their little lives. So starting with the basics, we all know what our 5 senses are, right? We have our touch, taste, smell, sight, and hearing. But there are also 3 additional senses that most people are not aware of unless you happen to be a therapist or a medical provider or even a parent who has a child that has already been diagnosed with a sensory processing disorder. Those other 3 senses are the vestibular sense, the proprioceptive sense, and the interoception sense. Okay, so don't freak out. I understand those are some big words, right? But I promise in an upcoming video, I'm going to break down all 8 of those senses, tell you exactly what they are and how they affect your child in their day-to-day activities. For the purpose of today's video, I just wanted to let you know, guys, that we no longer just have 5 senses. We've never only had 5, but we were taught that we only had 5 senses growing up, which was easy enough to understand. But now that we're older, it's time to realize and face the truth that we have 8, and some people are even saying even more, but that's another story for another time. When your child processes information from the body and from the environment and bring it all together to engage in some type of meaningful activity, that is what is called sensory processing. And when your brain organizes all of this information and makes sense of it, that is what is called sensory integration. So just to give you an example, your child may use their sense of smell as well as their sense of taste to eat a meal. They may use their sense of sight and their sense of hearing to look for an object, or when you call their name, to look for you in the room. So those are ways that our body is interpreting the senses that we have and making use of it in a functional way. Our sensory systems start developing quite early in our lives while we are actually still in the womb, and they continue to progress and develop as we grow through childhood and start to engage in more activities. Pretty much any and everything that your child does involves the sensory systems. So whether that's your child playing at the park, whether it's them taking a bath, eating a meal, sleeping at night, reading a book, all of those things require the interpretation and the correct processing of sensory information. So it's when your child is unable to perceive those different sensations correctly, that is when you start to notice that your child may have an issue with sensory processing. So that may result in your child having a difficult time engaging in play activities. You may start to notice some delays in some of their skills. You may see some behaviors that are negative or behaviors that are not so typical for children their age. Things that you believe should be easy and typical for your child to do may become quite hard for them if they are having an issue with sensory processing. So in addition to that, there are also different types of sensory processing difficulties that your child could have. So for example, if your child overreacts or underreacts to some type of sensory input, that is what is known as sensory modulation. So to give you an example, let's say your child is playing with a craft and they get glue on their hands and they absolutely freak out. They have a meltdown, they start crying, it's hard for them to pull themselves together, or it may look as if they want nothing to do with an activity because they're afraid of getting their hands messy. That could be a sensory modulation issue because they're overreacting to that sensation of touch, getting things on their hands, getting messy. Or it could also be underreacting. So for those kids out there who are it seems they're very low. It takes a lot to get them up and moving. Their arousal levels are typically very low, where it almost appears as if they're uninterested or lazy. That is what is also known as sensory modulation, but that is more of an underreaction to sensory input versus an overreaction to sensory input. Another type of sensory processing difficulties could be sensory discrimination issues. So sensory discrimination basically means your child is unable to discriminate between the extreme ends of that sense. So to break it down and give you an easier way to understand it, let's say your child is using a crayon or writing with a pencil and they're using way too much force, and it actually leads to them breaking their crayons or breaking their pencils when they're writing or drawing. This is what is known as a sensory discrimination issue, because they cannot discriminate how much pressure they really should use to be able to use the pencil or the crayon appropriately. Or let's say they're reaching and they're picking up a cup, like a plastic cup to drink out of. Some kids may use too much force, and when they pick up the cup, they squeeze it and like the drink spills out. Or some kids may not use enough force, so when they pick it up, the cup just falls out of their hand. This is a discrimination issue because they're not able to interpret how much force I need to actually pick up and hold this cup in my hand appropriately without spilling the drink. Some children may also have sensory dyspraxia issues. So dyspraxia basically just means kind of like a motor planning or poor coordination. So these are children that appear extra clumsy. They may have poor posture. They may also have issues following multi-step directions, such as getting dressed. They appear to have poor balance and poor coordination. Dyspraxia is not to be confused with dyslexia, which is a reading disorder. Dyspraxia is a motor planning disorder. Some behaviors that your child engage in may not even appear to be related to the sensory system, but in actuality, it really could be. So for example, some kids have a hard time with tolerating change. Some kids have a hard time with transitions. Some kids even have a hard time with self-regulating or self-calming or self-soothing. These could also be a sign of some issues with sensory processing. There are tons of behaviors that could be linked to sensory processing difficulties, and I don't have enough time in this video to go over every single one of them, but I have created a freebie for you all in the description below. If you click on the link, there is going to be a checklist that I made, and it's called sensory red flags. And basically, these are behaviors that you may have observed or behaviors that you may want to watch out for that may indicate that your child has a sensory processing difficulty or may have just some issues processing some sensory information that's impacting their day-to-day lives. Now, the checklist that I'm providing for you is not meant for you to self-diagnose. It's just meant to be a simple guide for you. And if you are noticing that you're checking off quite a few of the things on this checklist, or even if it's just one or two that completely stand out to you and it's really impacting your day-to-day life and your child's day-to-day life, then I highly recommend that you seek out an occupational therapist. If you're not sure of where to find an occupational therapist, you can reach out to your pediatrician and they may be able to guide you. Also, if your child is under 3, you may also want to look into your state's early intervention program, and they can also assist you with getting the correct services for your child. So as someone who's just learning what sensory is, please don't stress about knowing all of those big, long words. Sensory processing, sensory integration, sensory modulation, discrimination, dyspraxia. There's so many words out there. But if you are just a beginner, you have a child, or maybe you have a loved one, or maybe you're a teacher and you're not quite sure what's going on with a student that you see from time to time, just know that we all have 8 senses, and we use those 8 senses on a day-to-day basis to help us to carry out our day-to-day activities. And it's when our body and our brain is not correctly making sense of that information, that is when it leads to something called a sensory processing disorder or sensory processing difficulty. And if you're suspecting that your child, or maybe a child that you know or care for, is having some difficulties processing this information and it's causing them to act out in ways that they shouldn't, or be behind or be delayed in certain areas, that is when you should definitely seek out an occupational therapist for a more intensive evaluation. So guys, if you haven't done it already, please make sure you subscribe and hit your notification bell, because I am going to be doing a sensory series where I break down more things and dive a little bit deeper into sensory, what it is, the different senses, even go into sensory versus behavior, sensory diets. There's a lot more information to learn. And don't forget to download your free sensory red flag checklist. All right, guys, bye.